Okay, so this week we begin our first introduction to Marxism, and I think where we should begin is Marx picks up really where both Rousseau and Adam Smith leave off. So just to remind ourselves, Rousseau kind of offers us a moral critique, if you will, of the inequality of the modern capitalist period. And he's the first to point out that what is celebrated under capitalism, that is this accumulation of wealth at the top, the formation of some sort of state that protects that wealth, remember, it was based on theft, robbery, pillage, plunder, and that the nature, sort of the characteristics of those who sit at the top have been corrupted by this process, according to Rousseau. And the only way forward is to have some sort of society where all participants generally consent and create the laws and rules of that society. And he thinks by doing so, this will mitigate the inequality, mitigate the level of poverty and exploitation at the bottom and extremes of wealth at the top, mitigate it sufficiently so that people would consent. And he thinks that this would, remove the biggest conflicts in society and why their foundations are so unstable, but how this instability stems from this inequality. But again, never really offers us a method of how this can be done, at least not a clear one. And despite his critiques of the inequality, he thinks it's necessary to be maintained in some degree. But again, small doses, not being based on violence and so on. Okay, and Adam Smith, really what Smith offers us is in a way the opposite of Rousseau. So they're both looking at the same world. And when Rousseau concludes theft, lies, pillage, plunder, murder, and force are what the foundation is, Smith says no. Smith's critique and justification for the basic organization of capitalist society at the time is an analysis of the capitalist system as an economic system. So what Smith offers us is a sort of turn to what we call political economy. This attempt to talk about the politics, the political philosophy is rooted in the economic structure, how the economics of the society works. And Smith thinks that, the basic functioning of the capitalist system, with its forms of competition, drive towards profit, but internal mechanisms for restrictions on how much profit can be made and how much monopolies can be formed. He thinks that the internal market, regulates all of these things and works out a nice harmony where exploitation won't be so severe, because if it was, the workers would quit that place and go somewhere else. One company couldn't continuously make endless amounts of profit alone, because if it was a profitable industry, then other companies would enter into it. And so all these nice methods of competition put some kind of internal checks and balances on the extremities of wealth. So where Rousseau was critiquing the inequality without really finding a way to mitigate it, besides mentioning that it should be, Smith thinks that the mitigation method, the thing that puts the limits on how severe this inequality is, how severe the instability and strife between the rich and the poor gets, all of that can be limited by the economic system itself. But ultimately, Smith is offering a justification for the status quo based upon the methods of the capitalist market. Okay, so this is sort of the background. I'm going to say what Marx and Engels, because they are, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels are sort of co-thinkers that meet each other and struggle and start to analyze a lot of this together. But they are our first philosophers that are different from all the others. They are the first philosophers that are not academics, that are not, employed by a state or university, and where philosophy was not a career in that sense for them. They found writing jobs here or there, but primarily they were revolutionary activists who devoted their entire adult lives to social change and to the struggles of the working class, mainly in Europe. And they were ruthless critics of capitalism and the way it was organized for the benefit of the rich at the expense of the poor. And they, in a way, offered a critique of philosophy as a whole, in addition to their critique of capitalism. And that is that majority of the philosophers that we've studied, but for them it was the philosophy in general, all they've done is sort of analyzed things or gave their theoretical description. And so the critique goes, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. So for Marx and Engels, philosophy is supposed to be an instrument, not simply to describe or interpret the world, but to understand it in order to transform it. And that's why even today, for the most part, Marxism is a kind of, not forbidden, but sort of outlawed political philosophy. It does show up in the university once in a while, but usually it's as a foil to set it up in order to tear it down, if it shows up at all. And that's just because even as much as the world has changed, for the most part, the world of Marx's, second half of the 19th century is very similar, and foundationally it's the same as it is today still. So many of the criticisms we'll see apply just as much as they did then to today. And still to this day, Marxism offers the most extensive critique of the capitalist system. That's why many of the writings of Marx and Engels have been banned in many countries, and still are. Okay, so before we look into that, it's useful to have some background to the sort of philosophical method. So Marxism has a very specific method, what they called a scientific method, and I'll get to that in a minute. But really, it has several influences. One of the influences comes from the German philosopher Hegel, who, what he contributed is what comes to be known as dialectics, but it's just a technical term and I don't find it very useful. Really, it was a philosophy that tried to understand things in a process of development, right? In a process of sort of evolution, where they start out in one way and then over time they change. And so that in order to really understand complex phenomena, you have to understand them in a historical context and how they changed over time and how they continuously change. And this is important. In addition, it's influenced by the philosophies of materialism, which, for example, the opposite of this we saw early on when we talked about some philosophers who had this idea that you can have principles of how the world should be that you derive from God or from the authority of some religion, and then you impose those principles on the world. For Marx and Engels, they're influenced by this materialism that was a reaction to it. It was the materialism that we talked about during the Renaissance and onward, where new investigations into the world were rooted in science, were rooted in empirical investigation about nature and biology and so on. Well, no different for political philosophy. That is, the basic idea of materialism is that the method for understanding complex phenomena, whether that be biological, chemical, historical, social, the method to try to understand that can't be to just look in the minds of people's heads, right? But to actually look, or from gods or from religious doctrine, but to look in the world itself, right? And how this is relevant for sociology or for political philosophy is we have to try to understand societies and what's normal for them, what the rules are for them, how people behave in them, as being rooted in some kind of social organization, and we'll get to that, what we mean by social organization. But the final one was, and this includes Rousseau, is that, or this includes the legacy of Rousseau, is that another influence were on what were called socialist thinkers, but what Marx and Engels called them was utopian socialist thinkers. And this is important, why they were utopian. But basically, a lot of them wrote a lot about had critiques of capitalism, things like mass poverty, the lack of democracy, just the extreme exploitation and inequality in society, the complete misery of the working class and the conditions they found themselves in. And they also discussed an alternative to this, socialism, which for them was an idea of a society that was much more democratically run by the majority, in the interests of that majority, and really in the interest of humanity as a whole, and not just the corporate interests of banks and corporations and those who own them. But they were utopian because even though they had these critiques of capitalism and its shortcomings, and even though they had, they could point to at least an idea of how things could be run differently, to remove the main problem of capitalism for these utopian thinkers was that it was organized for the interests of a tiny minority who controlled the wealth and resources. And they said, well, if you want to deal with that problem, the solution would be to democratize society so it could be run by the majority. So they were able to point to the critiques, they were able to point to an alternative, but they were utopian in the sense that they could offer no bridge from their critique to a transformation of a new society, right? And this utopian really is an important criticism because, think about it. To call someone utopian is like to say that your analysis is kind of wishful thinking. As a kid in elementary school, I used to wish that I had the desk that I could put my homework inside the desk. It was the kind that you lift up, right? You lift up the desk and then you close it. And I wished I could just put my homework in, lift up the desk, put my homework in, close it, and the next time I open it, I'd pull it out and it'd be completed. Okay? I mean, who wouldn't want that, right? Then I can just go to recess or whatever. That's utopian. It's utopian. Why? Because what I want from this desk, I have no bridge of making it a reality, right? So it's certainly not a very useful critique of a desk to say that it can't transform your homework, or I wish that it could, without having a kind of bridge to get there. And so for Marx and Engels, their method is that what they called scientific socialism, really putting all these together, was to try to understand human history and this process of development. How did it change? What pushed it forward? What was its main driving forces? How did capitalism come to be? Because it didn't always exist. How does it function? What are its main conflicts that organize within it? And if it can be changed, we need to identify the actual legitimate source of change within it. So they want to provide a scientific analysis, not a utopian one, because they thought these other ones were very deficient. And so, in addition, one fourth level of influence, so in addition to Hegel's philosophy of trying to understand things in a process of change, in addition to the materialists who look for, actual explanations for reality based on really existing conditions, and in addition to their critique of the socialist utopians, they major influences from the political economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, who provided the first attempts at understanding the economics of capitalism. And they merge all of these together for their overall critique of capitalism and how it can be transformed. But it's also important to point out that a reason that their critique was so much more thoroughgoing than anything that came before it, when we compare what they say about capitalism to Rousseau, for example, in a way Rousseau is barely scratching at the surface without any kind of real concrete detail. It's as if he's giving a kind of timeless critique. But what we see in Marxism is real empirical, currently existing critiques of society and real descriptions of current reality for them. So another influence is that the time period, and similarly a major difference when we moved from Machiavelli to Hobbes to Locke and then to the American Revolution, was that this process of the development and maturation of capitalism is coming into, a much clearer picture, was just beginning. But by the time of Marx and Engels, not only has capitalism gone through its industrial revolution, or is, continuously going through it at this time, more importantly, so therefore the understanding what it is sharper and clearer, and its tendencies are clearer because it's produced more of them, namely, mass poverty in these urban cities of the working class, living in slums and with a lot of health problems and injuries and so on. But more importantly than all that, the force for transformation of society was showing itself. So, in the time period of Marx and Engels is a time period of revolution. Not just the previous revolutions that we talked about that overthrew feudalism and paved the way for the capitalists to be in control of the state and the government, but the working class has begun to fight back and showed itself and carried out massive struggles in all over Europe and really many parts of the world. This industrial proletariat is, in its first instance of coming into existence, was breaking up the machinery, lighting their workplaces on fire in some cases, marching into work with weapons to smash the machines that were, exploiting them, whole cities going on strike and organizing ways to feed each other in the midst of it. Anyway, what you see is a real, almost civil war-like structure where there's a new force in society that is taking shape, starting to learn who it is, understand itself, and so on. And so Marx and Engels can see that, and for them, their analysis of capitalism includes in it this potential force to transform it as well, because it was much more visible to them. And so this connects to part of the reason why the previous thinkers that had critiques of capitalism were utopian. It's because they were a little too early to really see the bridge, or at least a force in society, a force for change, a force to confront the problems that capitalism created. It was all hypothetical for them because the working class hadn't produced many rebellions in the earlier period. So for Rousseau, the working class is barely mentioned, and it's certainly not referred to as a kind of fighting force of social change. And for the utopians, they could have their critiques of capitalism. They could, sketch out what a potential new way of organizing society could be, but they rarely referred to the working class as an agent, right? As an entire agent for transformation. And for Marx, what's unique to the working class under capitalism, that just wasn't there under feudalism, what we could put it this way: what gives the working class this transformative power? What makes it what Marx calls the revolutionary agent of capitalism? That is, within the capitalist society, which class has the potential to be revolutionary? That is, transform it. Under feudalism, we saw that the bourgeoisie, the capitalists themselves, were revolutionary. That is, as they were expanding investments and expanding commerce and the market and the economy, they were revolutionizing the economic structures of feudalism to the point that it reached a head, and it convulsed into these political revolutions where they slowly acquired control of the political structure, the state, the government. And we saw that in the English Civil War, we saw that in the American Revolution, we saw that in French Revolution, where the capitalist class asserts itself and gains political control over the government. Well, what is it about the working class within capitalism that makes it the revolutionary agent? And again, the answer to this question isn't something that you deduce by sitting back in your chair thinking about it. It has to be visible and demonstrated, in material reality. And it wasn't available and visible for the early period of capitalist history. It became glaringly apparent, again, once we hit the Industrial Revolution. And that is what Marx calls the socialization of production. So what does that mean? Well, it's easy to compare it to understand it when you compare it to what it was before. So under feudalism, you don't have what we would call the socialization of production. You have individualized production. So what does that mean? Well, production of what? Production of the overall necessities, goods in society. And what is it that humans need to live on? What is it that they consume, and so on? For the most part, during feudalism, the production of those things were done by individuals. You had small land holdings in terms of peasants who would produce the agricultural goods. You had skilled craftsmen who would produce the other sorts of items, whether it was a cobbler or a carpenter, or, whatever the case may be. And it was individualized production. What's capitalism starts to do, especially post-industrial revolution, is it shatters those old means of producing things, the social relations of individualized producers, and starts to socialize those things. So we see the mechanization, the socialization of a classic example would be the evolution within the textile industry from these skilled weavers evolving into these massive textile manufacturing plants, where you're able to hire unskilled workers to work the machines and get rid of, basically bankrupt in a way, put out of business these skilled weavers. And so you see this over and over again, is that the overall means of subsistence and the means of what are the products of society are no longer produced by individuals, but produced by the working class as they are organized into larger and larger units. So even today we could zoom out of any major city. Like you could take the Bay Area, and we could, if we had interesting graphics or something, we could see, where are the goods and services produced, where do they come from, we'd see the activity of the ports and the unloading of goods from the ports onto trucks and the distribution of all those goods. We'd see, goods going to, say, the grocery stores. We'd see the transportation workers. We'd see the water treatment facilities. We'd see the refinery plants in Richmond and San Pablo area. Anyway, what you would see is the socialization of production. That is, what people need and rely upon in their day-to-day lives comes from large groupings of workers working together collectively, not individuals. So that gives the working class a very powerful role in society if it's organized and used in its own interests. And that was precisely what was happening after the Industrial Revolution, and especially by the time Marx and Engels are writing in the middle of the 18th century, is that the working class was asserting itself as a new social force in society with the potential for revolutionary transformation. And at this point, I think it's important to say that this idea of a class position, that is, a position of a class in society being linked to its outlook, right? Sort of almost determining its overall worldview or view of itself and society is very important. So what we get in the beginning of the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto and many, many other writings is that one of the things that Marxism contributes is this analysis of the history of societies being the history of class struggle, right? A struggle between classes. And as we can see, we've already begun to sort of trace this idea in many of the philosophers we've already looked at, all the way beginning with Plato and his discussion of tyranny, oligarchy, democracy. He doesn't call it explicitly class forces and class struggle, but that's precisely what it is. So it's worth just take a minute. The opening lines, we get the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles, freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on in uninterrupted, now hidden, now open, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Just to continue, last part here. In the earlier epochs of history, we find almost everywhere a complicated arrangement of society into various orders, a manifold gradation of social rank. In ancient Rome, we have patricians, knights, plebeians, slaves. In the Middle Ages, feudal lords, vassals, guildmasters, journeymen, apprentices, serfs. In almost all of these classes, again, subordinate gradation. So this is important for us because we've seen it in the philosophers we've looked at, is that the societies that the philosophers emerge from are societies, overridden with class struggle. And oftentimes the political philosophy that we've looked at is trying to eradicate or rectify or minimize or mitigate that class struggle. But almost in every single instance is trying to maintain those class divisions, never trying to eradicate them. And so one shortcoming in the eyes of Marx of the previous philosophers is that they didn't understand the class struggle that was existing in these societies, the class inequality, the class divisions, the class war, in a certain ways, the real state of war of Hobbes and Locke is a class war. And the function of the Commonwealth is to try to not end that class war, but to make sure that it skews in the direction of the ruling class. At least in that sense, Madison, Hamilton, and even Jefferson were a little more explicit and conscious about this. They recognized the class war in their society, and they saw consciously that the instrument of the state, is something to be used in order to protect the opulent against the masses. Marx is drawing this point a little bit further in going, in fact, that the various ideas we have in society correspond to what class position people come from. That doesn't mean, to each individual, if they're in class X, they'll have the exact same views as another person in class X. No, not by any stretch of the imagination, but the dominant ideas, the general ideas of a society, certainly the dominant ones, are those that reflect the interest of a ruling class, and that, general ideas about what should be done, could be done, an assessment of what a real problem is, what isn't, typically also reflect a kind of class position. And so we can see in the philosophers that we've had what we haven't run into yet, really, and people have commented on this in their reflections, is we've never heard a philosopher who writes about from the perspective of, say, the slaves of ancient Greece. No, I don't know of any such philosopher. We've heard the perspective of those that justify it. Even in Machiavelli's terms, who was a little nervous about the class struggle and the class war, and the prince being careful about not pissing off the majority of the population, which happened to be these small wage workers or these poor peasants. But it was still written from the perspective of the prince and how the prince should navigate this. What we get in Marxism is a philosophy that is rooted in the struggles of the largest class in society, the working class. And that makes it very different than anything we've looked at thus far. Okay, so now we can turn to kind of basic assessment of what capitalism is. So for Marxism, like I said earlier, its main contribution is its critique of the functioning of capitalism, which is mainly a description of how it works. And so we'll start with that on an overview and look at much more detail next week. But, first, what is capitalism? So its main, what makes it special, capital, what you have to understand what capital is to say what capitalism is. And before we do that, its basic property, sort of essential properties, is that it's a system where what Marx calls the means of production, so that is all of the instruments of producing things, whether it be the factories, whether it be ships, whether it be farm equipment, banks, all of this is owned in addition to, the means of production and the means of subsistence, right? That is all the things that humans need in order to survive. Those two things, the instruments used and the things that are produced that we need to survive, the means of production and means of subsistence, are all owned privately by a small class of owners, namely the bourgeoisie or the capitalists. And there is really only one purpose for that ownership, right? And that's where the term capitalism comes from. It is to increase the capital. So capital includes the holdings, right? That is the ownership of the factories, the instruments, the equipment, the purchase of the raw materials that are used to produce things, right? And the hiring of the laborers. All of that is capital. So think of it as it's an upfront expenditure or investment to put their ownership of various things to work, right? In order to produce something, and at the end of that, to return a higher amount of capital than they began with, right? That is capitalism. That's its primary purpose. So the purpose of this ownership is to make investments and to generate, a larger amount of wealth. And then there is the working class, and it is the vast majority of society that does not own either the means of production or the means of subsistence, right? So, I could venture a guess that nobody listening to this is in this class is a capitalist. You don't own unless you own the means of production, and you would fall therefore into the working class, just by virtue of the fact that you don't own the means of production or the means of subsistence. And the only way, therefore, under capitalism, for members of the working class to survive is by getting a wage in order to pay for what they need to survive. So there's our two basic classes in society under capitalism. Of course, there's gray area. You might own a small business and so on. We can talk about those details later. But those are the two main classes determined by their relationship to the means of production and the means of subsistence. That is, do they own it or do they not? Another point is that we see the functioning of capitalism clearer when we look at the way that it came to be. And we're not going to go through a large history of this, but there's a couple points that need to be made, which is there is a transition that takes place from feudalism to capitalism. And we've discussed this a little bit in terms of, these new merchants that are rising up, but there's an important point to be made, which is for that full transition to take effect, the main classes of feudalism should no longer exist, and the main classes of capitalism do exist, right? That means the transition has taken place because they are not the same system. And so the question is, that Marx points out and spends a lot of time on, is to understand that transition is also to understand how capitalism works. So I just want to spend a few minutes going over this transition so that we can understand these key categories of what's difference between feudalism and capitalism. So first and foremost, under feudalism, we have to look at, well, what's the main source of wealth? And the main source of wealth is tied to a taxation of land. So the peasantry, what do? They work the land and they produce primarily all of the food and raw agricultural products. And they don't, but they don't own this land. They rent it. The land is controlled. Ownership of the land is a little gray area, but the view of feudalism was that, we heard this in Locke, the Lord, well, we heard an aspect of it, that God gave the world to everyone, and therefore under feudalism and these absolute monarchies, they had this view that, those that were more closely tied to God controlled the land. And so they would allow, basically allow people to live within their kingdoms. And the landlords, right? That's why you pay your rent even today to a landlord. It's because it comes from the lord of the land. You pay them rent. So what happened is the peasantry, for the most part, would pay in various different ways. Either they would, use the land that they were renting and produce enough for them to live off of, and then sell whatever excesses they had to pay the rent, or they would give that rent over in kind, or sometimes even they would go and just work for free the land of the Lord, and everything that they produced went to them. But in essence, what we look at here is that the peasantry produced some amount for them to subsist on, and everything else that they produce went to the Lord. And this is where the surplus or the wealth was generated under feudalism. And the political power in feudal society is not owned, but is held by the nobility, the king, the landlords, and the nobles, right? And as we said, but at the same time, within this world of feudalism, there are also some other social roles being played by this rising bourgeoisie, right? That is these small-time merchants that slowly become bigger over time, start to evolve into mini bankers, and then eventually become small industrialists and producers. And what do the merchants do? As we said, they amass their wealth by moving goods from one location to another and buying them cheaper than what they sell them for. Okay, and slowly they start to amass enormous amounts of wealth. And eventually, their economic control of society that they start to take over gradually starts to bump into political limits. That is, that in order for them to continue to carry out the growth of these markets, the growth of their businesses, the further growth of production, they need to have some kind of political control and wrench that away from the monarchy, because they really have a different, completely different interests. And they see those interests really being limited by the monarchy at a certain point. In the form of the monarchy decides taxes, the monarchy decides whether wars get entered into, whether investments take place in roads and this sort of thing. You could think of the monarch as sort of this image of somebody who consumes their wealth and turns it into gold-plated, balusters and things like this, as opposed to the capitalists really want to take that wealth and reinvest it in production and expansion of production, invest it in capital. And so over time, yes, this clash emerges, and we have various political revolutions that we've mentioned in passing. The English Revolution, the American Revolution, which is interesting. The American Revolution is sometimes thought of as this long revolution, which includes both the Revolution of Independence, but also the Civil War, because the Revolutionary War gains independence from Britain and allows the beginnings of a much more independent capitalist investment to take place in the North. But we know in the South that transition to capitalism didn't take place. The interests of the plantation owners really was to maintain slavery. That's it. to maintain slavery, as long as they had a market to sell whatever agricultural products that were produced by the slaves, they were fine in keeping things as is, whereas the North eventually wanted to industrialize the South, wanted to decide on what new territories were taken over when the westward expansion was happening. Would those be slave states? Would they be free states, quote unquote? In other words, would they be states integrated into the capitalist North? And so the Civil War kind of is the final victory, if you will, of capitalism in the Americas, in North America. And then, of course, there's the French Revolution, which we talked a little bit about last time, and really revolutions all over Europe that signal the end of feudalism, the beginning of capitalism. Okay, then the question is, well, once capitalism comes to be in this more mature way, and feudalism is overthrown, the capitalists now are able to, in the interests of capital, are able to sort of take the reins of power, organize the state, the government, to serving those interests. And those that are profiting off of capital become the new ruling class. But the new source of wealth under capitalism is no longer the exploitation of the peasantry, right? This is important. The dominant classes in capitalism, as we said, are the ruling class, the capitalists, and the working class, right? The proletariat, which means propertyless. Not the peasantry. The peasantry does still exist. So it's important to say, well, what happened to the old classes of capitalism? Well, the most important of which are, another way to phrase that question is, the working class is not a class under feudalism. So where does it come from? How does it come to be? What gives birth to it? What gives birth to the proletariat? Just to say, because we'll look at this next week, the source of wealth under capitalism being tied to the working class is different from the peasantry in the sense that workers are hired. They're hired for a particular wage. That is, they're given some sort of value for their work, and then they produce something, and then that produces a certain value. Now, what Marx is going to point out, we'll look at this next week, is that in that exchange, when you hire a worker, it's a completely useless endeavor if you don't receive more from them than what you gave them in return for their payment. And so this, if you think about what we said about the peasantry produces a certain amount, and then they give over an excess to the ruling class. Well, similarly, a worker is hired for a certain wage, but then they give over to their employer a certain amount of work, and the value of that work has to be higher than the value of that wage. Otherwise, there'd be no profit. But we'll look at that next week. And maybe one last thing before we look at the origins of the proletariat is there's a reason the Industrial Revolution follows the political revolutions of capitalism. And I alluded to this before, but under feudalism, for the most part, all of this extra wealth that was being generated and extracted from the peasantry was often going, through the monarchy through the form of taxation, and was often spent on, just excess and luxury items, or squandered in new palaces and things like this. With a huge difference, however, is that much of the wealth from feudalism, from these colonial expansions and these, journeys of pillage and plunder all around the world, once we have political power in the capitalists, that wealth is now being reinvested back into production, right? And so it makes sense then that you would have these political revolutions that put the state, that is the decision-making of the country, in the hands of the capitalist class. And once that gets going, you see the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, because now the obstacles to putting that wealth back into production and back into the interests of the new class have been removed. Okay, so where does the working class come from? And to understand this, I'm going to have you watch this clip, which is the introductory, scene of this film, the young Marx. And in it, we'll talk about it in a minute, but in it you'll see some peasants who are gathering wood, and then in comes the state, a wing of the state, these police, that punish them for doing this, and we'll have to talk about sort of why is this such a significant event that takes place in the beginnings of capitalism.
Um sich grünes Holz anzueignen, muss man es gewaltsam von seinem organischen Zusammenhang trennen. Beim Raffholz dagegen wird nichts vom Eigentum getrennt. Nur das bereits vom Eigentum getrennte wird vom Eigentum genommen. Und trotz dieses wesentlichen Unterschiedes nennt ihr beides Diebstahl und bestraft beides als Diebstahl. Es gibt zwei Arten von Verderbtheit, sagt Montesquieu. Die eine, wenn das Volk die Gesetze nicht befolgt. Die andere, wenn es durch die Gesetze verdorben ist. Ihr habt den Unterschied zwischen Diebstahl und Sammeln verwischt. Aber ihr irrt, wenn ihr glaubt, es sei in eurem Interesse. Das Volk spürt die Strafe, aber es sieht nicht das Verbrechen.
Okay, so in this scene is very important. What we see, the point that we hear in the narration is from a text that Marx wrote at the time, where he says, "You've erased the difference between theft and gathering. You think it's in your interests, but people only see the punishment, not the crime." So, what is this difference between theft and gathering? That's important, and it's linked to the story of the birth of the proletariat, or what we should call, what Marx called the proletarianization, that is the turning into the proletariat of some other classes. So in fact, the proletariat isn't born out of nothing. A more accurate story is that prior feudal classes become proletarianized. That is, they become turned into the proletariat. So the two main classes in feudalism that become proletarianized is the proletarianization of the peasantry. The peasantry becomes increasingly proletarianized, that is turned into the proletariat. And these middle classes, the artisans, if you will, they get proletarianized as well. And so it's just important to see these two trends because they give us a sense of Marx's overall critique of capitalism, and we'll see they lend themselves to being able to provide an agreement with Rousseau's critique, but also they provide it with a little more content. Okay, so in brief, it's linked to this gathering versus theft, is that the peasantry under feudalism was a necessary class. So their preservation was important. That is, feudalism couldn't go on. The monarchy wouldn't have any wealth if you didn't have the peasantry. So the peasantry needed to subsist, right? So that's why they had access to, they had their own tools for farming. They had access to the land, and they also had access to the commons, where, your own little plot of land isn't able to provide you with everything. You need hunting grounds, you need grazing grounds, and you need areas to collect wood and stuff like this to keep warm. And so that was a normal feature of feudalism. What happens is, once the capitalism gets going, they need laborers. But why would a peasant leave their farm and go work in these gruesome conditions at hours of the day that are different, where all of their work is sort of owned and controlled by the person hiring them? Typically they wouldn't, unless somehow they became propertyless, right? That is, unless they were separated from the means of subsistence. That is, they could no longer subsist as they were. So this period of transition is what we mentioned is called enclosure, where in a number of different ways, there's various enclosure acts, started early on in England, but then you saw them elsewhere throughout Europe, where the commons was enclosed, where it was no longer allowed for, this area of the commons, which used to be, big, is now smaller and smaller and smaller. And now you can no longer go into that area and pick up wood for staying warm. So that's what we see in this clip, is that you've converted theft into, you've called gathering theft, right? You've converted what used to be called gathering, you call it theft, but nothing has changed. But what they did was they basically privatized the commons and said you can no longer collect it. In addition, your grazing areas were getting smaller and smaller, and this was just destroying the peasantry and proletarianizing them rapidly, because they could no longer survive on the little meager plot of land that they had if they didn't have access to the commons. So the enclosure of the commons is a major first step in the act of proletarianization of the peasantry. You've separated them from the means of subsistence, and now, in order for them to subsist, they can't continue as they were. They have to go get a wage, get access to some kind of currency so that they can then, exchange it for basic food and eventually rent and so on. In addition, the other group to get proletarianized is the more skilled laboring class, precisely because what capitalism is doing is not automating, but sort of mechanizing or mass turning into mass production a lot of the skilled artisan crafts, right, in the form of industrialization. So what industrialization does is rapidly increase the wiping out of various skilled crafts. And so they get proletarianized as well. And, early on in capitalism, you take terms like loitering, vagrancy. These early laws, we see them in the manufacturing cities in England, where a lot of people who will become proletarianized because of the laws around the enclosures flock to the cities for work. There's more people than there is work. So then there's a question of these loitering laws where, basically, what are you doing here? You can't be just walking around the city unless you have a business of being here. And then they would be arrested for loitering and often put into what was called the poorhouse. And guess what your punishment was for loitering? Was to work in various factories. We wouldn't call it prison labor because it wasn't exactly prison labor, but it was the punishment was that you'd go have to work yourself out of this debt. And so the early conditions of the working class still are, but were extremely exploitative in a number of ways. And it really was not possible until the capitalists had control of the state, so they can pass these various laws that allow society to be catered to their interests. And so this process of proletarianization to meet the growing needs of industrialization, the growing needs of the capitalist economy, simultaneously is giving rise to the birth of class struggle, as we briefly mentioned. And what we'll look at, next time really is this mechanism, the main core mechanism of capitalism, its generation of profit. How does it work? How does it come from? In more detail is another one of Marxism's main contributions to its critique of capitalism. We won't really look at this question of revolutionary change until the last section of this. Maybe just the last couple points to conclude on is that Marx's critique of capitalism provides us with a continuation of Rousseau's critique, but with much more detail. So we already talked about Rousseau giving us this sense that the wealth that was generated was ill-gotten in some way. What Marx does is more of an empirical method, but lays out the process by which capitalism had to do this. If we understand what capitalism is, we understand how it came to be. And in it, we see, yes, that in fact the wealth that is concentrated at the top was based on manipulation, theft, exploitation, and so on. It is not industriousness. If industriousness means some kind of, clever, merit-based ingenuity, right? It's brute force for the most part. And it wasn't until the capitalists had political control that they could carry it out more swiftly by having the state, the Lockean state, if you will, the Commonwealth, where they can make the rules. Right? The Madison's instrument of the opulent against the majority. So it is a continuation of that critique. In addition, it's a much clearer statement and analysis of what the function of the government is. It's very much in line with what Hamilton and Madison and Locke say, but it's not done in the positive, it's done in the negative, is that in fact the instrument of the government is nothing more than the instrument, what Marx called, for managing the affairs of the bourgeoisie. The precise quote is, the executive of the modern state is but a committee for managing the common affairs of the whole bourgeoisie. What this is that it's the idea that the government itself, its entire function, is to be a useful instrument, right, for the ruling class, for this group of owners of the means of production and means of subsistence. They make up, either individually or through proxy, the representatives. It's their state. And its purpose is to manage the whole affairs, right? We'll come back to this a little later in this section, but what's important about this for us in terms of what's new is none of the previous philosophers we've looked at made the connection to the function of the state as being a function of class rule. In some, it was implicit. In some, the state was, again, the instrument to sort of mitigate these class forces, or was to correct the problems of some class interests being more dominant than others. With Marx, we get, no, that's not the case. This function of the state is nothing more than the instrument to represent the interests of the ruling class. And it is a dictatorship of the ruling class. That ruling class may have elections that are done in a republic, in a semi-democratic way, but in fact, at the end of the day, the dominant interests of society are what are the interests of capital? What are the interests of the banks, of the large corporations? Today, we'd say, these massive financial institutions and these multinational corporations and so on, and the role of the government is to represent those interests, to manage those affairs. Today we see this in a much more expansive way. Everything from what is the interest rate going to be set at? How will that benefit the corporations and the banks? How will the next round of bailouts be organized? How will that maintain the interests of the capitalists? Policy on healthcare, who will be taxed to pay for this, and so on. even if we started to look at it, education, the question of war and military interventions, we see those. We could, draw out the connection between those events and the interests of capital and so on. But we get the government is this enlarging, in fact, committee to manage all of these affairs, not in the interest of one company versus another, but in the interest of the whole the class as a whole. Okay, so for the last point here, I just want to mention there's another aspect of Marxism that's unique from the previous philosophers, and it's that, for those of you who are, finding Rousseau refreshing due to the critiques that he offered of inequality and so on, ultimately, however, Rousseau proposes a kind of solution that doesn't really solve much. The idea of incorporating the masses into the decision-making process of laws and that they consent is precisely what was being what was being avoided in the American Revolution, and what was certainly led to the... Okay, so the last point I want to emphasize is another way in which Marx is very different from Rousseau. Rousseau was correct, and many of you felt it refreshing, that this inequality in society is based on, real brutality, force, etc., theft, and is unjustified. And his correction, however, to this inequality was this idea of consent, of general consent of the population. The problem with that general consent, which we alluded to last time, is it would mean that the majority would participate in government, and their interests would be brought into the discussion, which is precisely what was being avoided consciously by the new ruling classes. We see that clearly in the American Revolution, and absolutely we see that clearly in the French Revolution, precisely because these interests are at odds with one another. There is no real reconciliation, and we're going to see why more clearly next week. But there isn't. If Rousseau was correct that the wealth is generated by theft from the others, then how do you reconcile that, in fact? And so Marx goes a step further and sort of picks up where Rousseau left off, in the sense that Rousseau is correct to point out this inequality as being sort of central to the problem, but it can't be reconciled in this society so long as, because the two interests are diametrically opposed to one another. The interest of wealth, we're going to see, is inextricably linked to the poverty of those. The gains in wealth is tied in some fashion to the impoverishment of the masses. And so Rousseau offers an attempt at a kind of way of reforming the system politically as his means of trying to mitigate the class conflict in society. But for Marx, this is also utopian. This idea of reforming the system to sort of, make it do something that it can't is a dream. So, in fact, the only method, which was mentioned earlier, is a revolutionary reconstruction of society. That is, a new organization of society to meet the needs of the majority, which would be the end of capitalism as we know it. It would be a new political system, a new form of government. It would be a true democracy, and so on and so forth. Point is, where Rousseau falls short is his attempts to reform by way of different conception of legislation and participation, whereas Marx is arguing explicitly that the system can't be reformed, and a revolutionary reconstruction or transformation of society is the only method to meet the needs, to address the wrongs that we see